Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is David Novak. I used to be a poet and playwright, and now I am a reader. It has been a long cherished ambition of mine to become one, but I was stymied by my innate laziness. Since January of 2022, I've been working to change that. BookTube has been a great inspiration to me, so now I am trying to pay it forward by posting the occasional video in which I talk about books. So I thought I would make another video talking a little bit about the books that I've read recently. And I have a tendency to be long-winded, so I thought I will try to be succinct and restrain myself to 3 points. Number one, why I read the book. Number two, something about the book. And number three, my thoughts about the book. I've read a number of things lately, and I know. So let me get into it. The first book that I read in this period was Untouchable by Mulk Raj Anand. My first novel by him. It was his first novel to have written. And it tells the story of a young untouchable in India, a boy it begins with him cleaning the latrines and follows him throughout the course of one day. The theory behind the Untouchable case was that you have to handle shit, you have to deal with shit, you clean shit, therefore you yourself are shit. And people treat him that way. Accidentally coming into contact with him is a big deal for anybody on the street and whatnot. His day goes from bad to worse. Come here. Oh, whoops. Sorry about that. I don't want him to knock my phone over, which is perched trying to film me. That happened earlier today in a previous attempt. So the story contains a lot of invective, a lot of abuse. It really paints a portrait of somebody born into that status. And the story was very moving. It's a very short novel. And what it does uniquely, I thought, was it culminates not in a great breakthrough for the character or anything like that, but all of a sudden he finds himself in the midst of a great historical scene. And I don't want to give any spoilers, but I've read a couple of novels that I can think of that do that thing, and this novel does it very successfully. It was a really great read, and I recommend it heartily to anybody else. Now, the next thing that I read was the Diary of John Adams. This was a book which I started last year and read up until December. I was doing 20 minutes a day. That's how I get through this kind of thing. And hurt my back, and so had to replace that time with some dedicated physical therapy, which I've only recently stopped doing, although I probably should still be doing it. And the story behind how I got to reading John Quincy Adams's diary is worth sharing, I think. About 2 years ago, I read the Library of America Civil War anthology. It's a set of 4 books with each volume focusing on 1 year of the war. And The sources of the material cover a wide swath. It's not all just one figure. You know, my previous experience of the Civil War was almost entirely through the lens of Abraham Lincoln. A little bit later, I came to the Civil War also through the lens of Frederick Douglass. But the anthology presents really a broad swath, and almost everything in it, well, actually everything in it is worth reading. In the course of reading that, I came upon two historical figures which intrigued me, Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. To give you a little background, when I was a child growing up, I don't recall much of American history, but what we had was very slanted or stilted toward the loser South. We didn't think of them as the loser South. We thought of them as the noble South. And so we were instructed or urged to think of men such as Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson as heroes. And in my own family, we had a family myth that we were related to Stonewall Jackson. It turned out not to be true. And what the status of the myth at this time is, I'm not really certain. But that was my predisposition. Figures like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, even to this day, are neglected and disregarded in the general discourse. As I say, ruffians like Robert E. Lee have, I want to say, captured the public imagination, but really they've been forced upon the public imagination, which should not be. Stevens and Sumner need to be remembered more deeply than they are. You can hardly find their books. So I found a couple. Thaddeus Stevens, there's his selected papers, edited by Beverly Palmer. And Charles Sumner, there's his selected letters, also with the same editor, in conjunction with somebody else, I believe. Now, reading papers and reading letters is kind of hard because you get sort of an incomplete picture, a one-sided story. But I wanted to know the men. I didn't want to know about the men. I didn't want their biographies. Since then, I have picked up a couple of biographies, and I hope to get to them one day. But it's not certain that I will, but I was very glad to read them. Thaddeus Stevens was a terrible writer, by which I think they may have been referring primarily to his penmanship, but his writing is hard, but he has some wonderful speeches. Charles Sumner is the opposite. He was a mellifluous writer, and his letters are all easy to read. But what we really lack for both of those men, we need a selected speeches, which are not obtainable. Somebody needs to edit a volume like that. You don't really need a complete speeches for either man, I am sure. But selected speeches would be very nice. Great American heroes, honestly. So I read both of those on my plan of doing 20 minutes per day. And when I finished them, I didn't really have to think too hard about what I was going to read next. I chose John Quincy Adams because in the prelude to the Civil War, he was an important figure. He was in the House of Representatives. And he was it would not be unreasonable to call him an abolitionist congressman. I don't think he called himself that, but he probably alone among the political figures of his day would not have objected at all to being called an abolitionist. So he kept this diary throughout the course of his life, from childhood till he was an old man, dying in 1848. And it really gives you a good picture of the country in that whole period. It turns out that the problem of slavery, actually the problem of the bullying slaveholders, the obnoxious slaveholders, began with the inception of the country and determined so much of the historical events from inception of the country. In fact, Quincy Adams, who personally knew Thomas Jefferson, ultimately came to detest him quite a bit, not just for the slanders and dirty deeds he did to his father, John Adams, but he attributes the whole states' rights argument and the whole destruction of the Union as based upon political policy done by Thomas Jefferson. I don't know the history. I need to read more to exactly understand the thinking, but he was no fan of Thomas Jefferson. And his diary is enlightening. He kept it, I guess, pretty much nearly every day for the course of his life. And the Library of America prints a selection in 2 volumes, and it's all interesting. And in the end, well, perhaps you don't, but I fell in love with John Quincy Adams. I wish we had more presidents like him. So that was what I undertook next. I felt I needed to finish it, so I read about the last 500 pages. Here's the first volume of it, which I read last year. And then here's the main portion of my reading, which I read immediately after Untouchable. So then after that, I read The Evidence of Things Not Seen by James Baldwin. And here's a screenshot. It was a download for about $2. And the reason I read that was I was watching a booktuber. The channel was To Be Black and Loved, and another one trying to knock the camera over, and he had read the book, which is about there was a bunch of murders in Atlanta, about 33, I think it was, of mostly young children. And James Baldwin went to Atlanta. His publisher suggested he do that, probably paid his fare, paid his expenses. And he wrote a long essay about it. I don't remember where it was published, possibly the New Yorker. I did not think it was a very good book. Baldwin was out of his league. He did no investigation to speak of. He was not an investigative reporter. I have a cat right over here trying to get the camera again. Let me just whoop. Okay. Well, that's taken care of, at least for now. He had his usual axes to grind, you might say, regarding the position of blacks in America. And don't get me wrong, there were some very salient bits. But all in all, the work was, I'm not sure what the right word is, desultory. It's just kind of meandering all over the place. And pretty much anything he says, there are some sentences that are pure zingers, but anything he says is, I think, a non sequitur, totally unrelated to any kind of comprehensive whole. It's almost like they're helicoptered in from some previous thing that he wrote a decade before. So, needless to say, my impression of the essay was not very good. If you want to start with Baldwin, the evidence of things not seen is not the place to start. You should go to his other earlier books of essays, his classic work like The Fire Next Time, etc. That was my response to the essay. And then next up, I decided to read, there's a novel by Patricia Highsmith named Carol, which, let's see if I can get this here. I'll get you a cover. Here's a cover of that. Now, this is not the edition that I read, but I picked something up online, again, for $2. The version that I read was called The Price of Salt, which I believe was the original title. It was retitled Carol, I believe, for the American market. I'm not sure if that's the case, but it seems like a dumbing down of the title. And I first heard that book mentioned by booktuber Ann Novella. And she and fellow booktuber Ollie of Criminale are doing a read-through of Patricia Highsmith's complete novels. And Carol, or The Price of Salt, was an early one, and she had a video about it that was very interesting. I'll try to link these things below if I can in the description. So I grabbed that and read it. And again, I was not wholly satisfied with that either. It was the story of a lesbian romance, which was a unique thing to do at the time, or I should say a lesbian romance with a relatively happy ending, which was a completely unheard of thing at the time. And the story was not all that well put together. It was derived from the author's personal experience working at a department store for the Christmas season, which I have done. And she captures the feeling of that very well, but I found her narrative style tedious. She tends to focus in on real minute and inconsequential details of things. I think she was thinking that was how to paint a picture of the scene. And, when I was in college and I took a short story writing class, that was a method that I thought was how you should do it. Hey, come on, hey! It doesn't do any good. The only thing that works is when the dog that was walking by moves on. But the novel did... Hey, come on, guys. The novel did pick up around chapter 18 when the two women are on a road trip, and all of a sudden they're being followed, they're being pursued, they're being spied upon. And all of a sudden the narrative got the thriller vibe or the suspense vibe for which Patricia Highsmith is well known. This is the first novel I read by the author, and I sort of wish I had started with one of her works that have been deemed classics of the genre, but I didn't. This Carol, or The Price of Salt, is an anomaly for her, but nevertheless, I was glad to have read it. It reminded me a little bit of Giovanni's Room. I can't say how much in detail because I read that book 40 years ago, but I imagine there are similarities because she was roughly a contemporary of Baldwin, and I imagine the novels came out sort of around the same time. Giovanni's Room details a similar theme. I didn't like that every other page characters are busy smoking, lighting up cigarettes, or they're going to a bar or a bar at a hotel or going and buying liquor and drinking it. I mean, if you're smoking, more power to you, but I don't need to hear about it on every other page, literally. So that was Highsmith. And then after that, now see, I don't need you mucking. After that, I went to another book by James Baldwin. This is a set of 4 interviews culminating in The Last Interview. The Last Interview is a series published by Melville House. And this is the only volume I have now read, but there's a story to this. And the reason I picked this up was because I didn't want the Atlanta essay to be the last Baldwin I would ever read. And I believe I have read most of his essays 40 years ago. And I wanted this to be the last note, and I knew it would at least partially be good because, well, let me tell you a little bit about the contents. There are 4 interviews in here. I don't know if I can show you the table of contents here, but each one conducted by a different person, published at a different time. So the first one was from 1961, done by Studs Terkel. Studs Terkel is a magnificent interviewer, and Baldwin talks about his book, No One Knows My Name, or Nobody Knows My Name. I can't remember. I think it's Nobody Knows My Name. But all of those old books I had in mass market editions way back. I got rid of them when the Library of America collected essays came out, edited by Toni Morrison. But I read all of those things before I was 20, and they had a big impact on me. His novels, not so much. I read Giovanni's Room and Another Country, but I was not a big fan of Baldwin's novels. But the essays I liked, and my first introduction was an interview under the title Go the Way Your Blood Beats from during the 80s, published in the Village Voice. I had a friend who lived in New York City at the time. Hey, come on. Hey, come on. Leave him alone. Come on. Yeah, he don't need that. Dog-cat love, which can get out of hand. So a friend of mine clipped that out from the Village Voice and lent it to me. I made a photocopy, which I still have buried in the vaults. And it's a very meaningful interview to me. The first 3 interviews in the book, the one by Studs Terkel, the second one, which gets into more discussion of literary matters. He talks about a book by William Styron, which James Baldwin defends eloquently. Can't remember the title. Something about the rebellion of Nat Turner, I think. I don't know what it was, but Baldwin talks about it and is very insightful in why he thinks it was a worthy addition to the American canon. I've never read the book. I don't really know much about it besides what I read in the interview. The Last Interview is a little bit of a disappointment because it was conducted about 2 weeks before Baldwin died. He was not well at all at the time, and so his answers to questions are sometimes less succinct, less to the point than you're used to if you've seen any of the videos of Baldwin, which you can find on YouTube. I mean, he is a brilliant speaker. But the Last Interview was lacking, partly due to the fault of the interviewer, who kept asking leading questions. You know, if you ask somebody, tell me the story about when you went to this place, it's much less interesting than if you ask an open-ended question, like, what do you think about such and such? Particularly if you ask a question that you don't know the answer to and you're really curious to find out the answer to. So the final interview was less than Baldwin at his best, but nevertheless, the entire book is worth reading. As I say, the third interview was where I started with Baldwin, and then I immediately went to Notes of a Native Son and Nobody Knows My Name, etc., which were all commonly available in mass market paperbacks at the time. So that was that. And then what I'm reading now is another book by Mulk Raj Anand, Coolie, which is his second novel. It's a much longer work. I'm 48 pages into it and really loving it. It is so good that I keep setting it aside because I don't want to go so fast with it. I'm finding certain scenes contain tension, and rather than resolving the tension by just reading through and finding out what happens, I set it aside and I just walk around with this tension because I don't know what's going to happen. So that is my recent reading, and I hope that you have enjoyed this little chat about them. I really need to, if I'm going to keep doing this, make videos more frequently so I can make a shorter video covering fewer books. Although I do find I like a larger number of books in the sense that there are resonances between the books, and you think about things differently when you think about everything grouped together like this. So this is my chat about what I have been reading recently. Thank you very much for stopping by.